She was the face that launched 1,000 dreams. The dark-haired, doe-eyed young woman who made the world fall in love with her in a single film, whose fragile beauty and quiet strength turned a simple college romance into one of cinema's most enduring tragedies. Ollie MacGraw was, for a brief and blazing moment, the most talked-about actress in Hollywood. And then, almost as suddenly as she had arrived, she was gone. Not because the offers dried up, not because the cameras stopped loving her, but because a man demanded it. That man was Steve McQueen. And now, at 85, Ollie MacGraw is finally talking about what it truly meant to be his wife. To understand what Ollie MacGraw lost when she stepped into Steve McQueen's world, you first have to understand what she had built. Her rise was not handed to her. Born in Bedford Village, New York, she grew up in a household scarred by her father's alcoholism and the constant emotional turbulence of her parents' troubled marriage. Stability was a luxury she rarely experienced. Confidence was something she had to scrape together on her own terms. She found her footing in fashion, guided early on by the legendary Vogue editor Diana Vreeland, whose eye for raw, unconventional beauty recognized something extraordinary in the young MacGraw. Modeling gave her discipline, structure, and a way into the world of visual storytelling. And when the opportunity for film came knocking, she answered it without hesitation. Her screen debut in the 1969 romantic comedy Goodbye, Columbus announced her as a genuine talent. Critics noted her naturalness in front of the camera, her ability to suggest depth without effort. Hollywood insiders took notice. One of them was Robert Evans, the suave and powerful head of production at Paramount Pictures. Evans not only cast her in what would become the defining film of her career, he married her. Love Story, released in 1970, was a cultural earthquake. The film grossed over $100 million worldwide, an extraordinary figure for its era, and MacGraw's portrayal of Jenny Cavallari, the sharp-witted, fiercely loving young woman dying of a terminal illness, made her a household name overnight. The film's tagline, "Love means never having to say you're sorry," became one of the most quoted lines in cinema history. Ollie MacGraw was nominated for an Academy Award. She graced the covers of every major magazine. She was, without question, one of the brightest stars in the Hollywood sky. She had a husband, a career, and in 1971, a son named Joshua. By every outward measure, her life was complete. And then Steve McQueen walked in. By 1972, McQueen was not merely a film star. He was a phenomenon. He had spent 2 decades carefully constructing an image, part rebel, part poet, entirely magnetic, that made him irresistible to audiences around the world. His work in films like Bullitt and The Great Escape had elevated him beyond celebrity into something approaching mythology. He was the man other men wanted to be, and the man most women found impossible to ignore. He was also, as many who knew him understood, deeply damaged. His childhood had been defined by abandonment. His father left before he could walk. His mother, struggling with her own demons, shuffled him between relatives and reform schools. He grew up learning that people left, that love was unreliable, that the only person he could truly count on was himself. Those wounds never fully healed. They simply went underground, only to resurface with explosive force in his closest relationships. When Ollie MacGraw arrived on the Texas set of The Getaway in 1972, she was still Evans's wife. She later admitted, in her frank and deeply personal 1991 memoir, Moving Pictures, that she already sensed the danger before filming even began. She knew, on some instinctive level, that proximity to McQueen would be her undoing. "I knew I was going to get in some serious trouble with Steve," she wrote. The admission was not dramatic flourish. It was an honest reckoning with the power he held over her before they had spoken more than a handful of words. Their chemistry on set was immediate and overwhelming. MacGraw would later describe McQueen's presence as almost supernatural in its effect. Men, women, and children alike could not keep their eyes off him when he entered a room. There was something raw and unfiltered about him, something that bypassed rational thought entirely. For a woman who had grown up starved of a certain kind of dangerous, consuming attention, He was intoxicating in the most literal sense. The affair began quickly. It became Hollywood's most talked-about scandal. By the end of 1972, MacGraw had filed for divorce from Robert Evans, the man who had given her the role that made her famous, the man who called what happened a blindsiding betrayal. The personal wreckage was significant, but MacGraw was in the grip of something she did not yet understand well enough to resist. In July 1973, Ollie MacGraw and Steve McQueen married. The wedding photographs were beautiful. The reality behind them was something else entirely. Before MacGraw could walk down the aisle, McQueen required her to sign a prenuptial agreement, ensuring she would receive nothing financially should the marriage dissolve. That demand, in isolation, might have been written off as the ordinary caution of a wealthy man protecting his assets, but it did not exist in isolation. It came packaged with something far more devastating: the explicit requirement that MacGraw give up acting altogether. She was, at that moment, one of the most in-demand actresses in the world. She was coming off an Oscar nomination and a $100 million film. She had scripts arriving at her door. She had a future in the industry that most performers spend their entire lives trying to build. And the man she had sacrificed her marriage to be with told her that none of it could continue. He did not want a working wife. He wanted her presence, her devotion, and her silence on the subject of her own ambitions. Extraordinarily, she agreed. She has spent many years since trying to explain that decision to interviewers who cannot quite believe she made it. The answer is not simple. It was partly love, the consuming, irrational kind that overrides self-interest. It was partly fear, fear of losing him, fear of his withdrawal, fear of the abandonment she had herself experienced in childhood, and which McQueen seemed, without knowing it, to embody and weaponize. And it was partly a form of emotional conditioning that she would only begin to understand much later, with the help of therapy and hard-won sobriety. So she stepped away. At the peak of her fame, Ollie MacGraw became a homemaker in Malibu. From the outside, their life together looked like the fantasy: a secluded house near the ocean, barbecues on the sand, a famous couple living with apparent ease far from the noise of Hollywood. McQueen cultivated that image carefully. He had always been skilled at controlling the version of himself the world saw. Inside the house, the story was different. His jealousy was relentless and entirely one-directional. If MacGraw so much as held another man's gaze for a moment too long, it could trigger hours of cold fury or explosive accusation. She learned to make herself smaller, to monitor her own behavior in exhausting detail, to anticipate his moods and adjust herself accordingly. The woman who had once commanded the screen with effortless charisma now spent her energy managing the emotional climate of her own home. Meanwhile, McQueen himself was, by multiple accounts and by the admissions of those who knew him well, serially unfaithful. Stories of his affairs circulated openly in Hollywood. He made little effort to hide them. The double standard was crushing. He demanded absolute loyalty from his wife while treating fidelity as an optional consideration for himself. It was the behavior of a man who had never truly resolved his relationship with trust, who both craved it and was constitutionally unable to offer it in return. His substance abuse ran alongside all of it. Heavy drinking and drug use were part of the fabric of his daily life, and they made the volatility worse. MacGraw, isolated from her career, from many of her old friendships, and increasingly from any sense of her own identity, began drinking more heavily herself. It was not a choice she made consciously so much as a slow drift toward whatever offered temporary relief from the suffocation she felt. She has said in interviews that she was afraid, during those years, to speak her own mind. Not afraid in the sense of physical threat, but afraid in a deeper, quieter way, afraid that honesty would cost her the relationship entirely. So she stayed quiet. She cooked. She kept the house. She raised her son. And she waited, without quite admitting to herself what she was waiting for. By 1977, something in Ollie MacGraw finally shifted. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of 5 years of self-erasure. Perhaps it was the growing recognition that the man she had surrendered everything for was not capable of meeting her halfway. Whatever the cause, She told McQueen she wanted to return to acting. The response was immediate and absolute. According to biographer Mark Elliott, McQueen told her plainly that if she intended to go back to work, then they were getting a divorce. No negotiation, no consideration, no acknowledgement that she was a person with her own history and ambitions and needs. Simply an ultimatum, delivered as though her career aspirations were a personal betrayal. MacGraw accepted the role of Convoy, directed by Sam Peckinpah, the same director who had helmed The Getaway and whose set had first brought her and McQueen together. The symmetry was not lost on her. She moved forward. The reconciliation attempts that followed were half-hearted on both sides. The gestures of two people who had already understood, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that the end had arrived. In 1978, the divorce was finalized. Their marriage had lasted 5 years. Then, in 1980, Steve McQueen died. He was 50 years old, taken by pleural mesothelioma, a cancer linked to asbestos exposure. He had kept his illness largely private, and his death came as a shock to a public that had never quite believed the king of cool could be mortal. For MacGraw, the grief was layered with complexity. She had loved him. She had been diminished by him. She had fought to free herself from him. And now he was simply gone, every unresolved thing between them permanently unresolvable. Years later, with the kind of honesty that only comes with real distance, she said quietly, "I wish we had both grown old sober." It is one of the most heartbreaking sentences she has ever spoken. The years that followed McQueen's death were not easy ones. MacGraw attempted to rebuild her career, taking on projects where she could find them, including an extended arc on the primetime series Dynasty in 1984. But Hollywood is not a patient institution, and the years she had spent away had shifted the landscape in ways that were difficult to navigate. She was no longer the luminous young newcomer of Love Story. The industry had moved forward without her, and reclaiming her former position proved more difficult than she had anticipated. More urgently, her own relationship with alcohol had become something she could no longer manage alone. By the early 1990s, she entered treatment at the Betty Ford Center, a decision she has described as one of the most important of her life. There she began to confront not just her drinking, but the entire architecture of painful experience beneath it. The childhood instability, the lost career, the years of self-suppression, the complicated grief of loving someone like Steve McQueen. In 1991, she published Moving Pictures, her memoir. It was candid in a way that surprised many readers who had known her only as a movie star. Honest about addiction, about the choices she had made, about the costs of placing love above self-preservation.